The air in La Lumiere crackled with quiet arrogance, as a waiter refused to serve Big Shaq, dismissing him with condescending smirks. But before the judgment could settle, a voice sliced through the tension, her own son's voice, revealing the truth behind Big Shaq's identity. The shockwave that followed didn't just silence the room, it shattered every assumption in an instant. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the heart of Beverly Hills, where the streets shimmered under crystal chandeliers and polished exteriors, La Lumiere thrived as a sanctuary for the elite. It was the kind of place where the clink of cutlery spoke louder than conversations, where appearances were as curated as the wine list. Tonight, the air buzzed with the usual soft laughter and murmurs of diners clad in designer labels, their presence a testament to the restaurant's exclusivity. The glass doors of La Lumiere eased open with a whisper, admitting a towering figure whose casual appearance disrupted the evening's perfect tableau. Shaquille O'Neal, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, worn sneakers and sweatpants, strode in with the ease of someone unconcerned with the stares that immediately fixed on him. At the reception, Emily's eyes flicked up from her tablet. Her polished smile faltered for the briefest moment before she composed herself. She was used to gatekeeping, used to deciding who belonged in this refined world, and who did. To her, Shaq's attire was a breach of the unspoken contract of La Lumiere's sophistication. Her smirk barely concealed her disdain as she stepped forward, her voice sharp enough to slice through the gentle background music. "Are you sure you can afford to dine here, sir?" she asked, the words dripping with feigned politeness, but loud enough for nearby diners to catch the insinuation. The weight of her tone, the subtle arch of her brow, communicated her real message clearly. He didn't belong. Shaq met her stare with quiet, steady calm. His deep voice, as smooth as a bass note, broke the tension without raising its volume. "Yes, I'm sure," he said, his tone polite yet unshakably firm. The exchange, though brief, sent ripples through the dining room. A hush spread as patrons, their curiosity piqued by the tension, exchanged glances. In the shadows near the service area, a young man, Emily's teenage son, Ethan, watched, his brows tightening. Clad in a crisp white shirt and black slacks, he was there for his weekend shift, but his attention was locked on his mother's interaction with Shaq. His heart sank with a mix of embarrassment and confusion. He had seen his mother wield this condescending mask before, but never with someone so composed, so unshaken. Shaq's measured response seemed to amplify the discomfort in the room, highlighting Emily's arrogance without her realizing it. Her smirk widened, an attempt to salvage her dominance, but the edges wavered under the silent scrutiny of the diners and her son's gaze. She gestured curtly, signaling Shaq to follow her. As he trailed behind, his presence seemed to stretch the distance between him and the carefully curated elegance around him. Tension hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, the weight of silent judgment pressing in from every corner of the room. The night was no longer just another luxurious evening at La Lumiere. It was the beginning of a story that would unsettle more than just the restaurant's gilded ambiance. It would test perceptions, expose prejudices, and force revelations, not through confrontation or noise, but through the quiet, unwavering presence of a man who refused to be rattled. Emily's heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor as she led Shaq through the heart of La Lumiere. The restaurant's luxurious glow, from the towering crystal chandeliers to the hushed conversations of diners, contrasted starkly with the growing tension trailing in their wake. Instead of guiding him toward one of the prime tables that overlooked the softly lit garden, or the central fireplace where VIP guests often sat, Emily veered toward the farthest, dimly lit corner near the swinging doors to the kitchen. Her smirk was thinly veiled, but her voice rang out just loud enough for those nearby to catch. "This spot should suit you perfectly," she said, the words coded in false politeness as she gestured toward a cramped table wedged against the wall. Shaq, his expression unreadable, lowered himself into the chair with the same grace that had once commanded roaring crowds on the basketball court. He adjusted his sleeves with a slow, measured movement, his calm challenging the scorn Emily had tried to project. He met her gaze with a faint smile, his eyes steady, unshaken by her blatant attempt to diminish him. Her hand rested on the back of the chair for a moment longer, her smirk faltering as she waited for some sign of discomfort or protest. When none came, she dropped the menu onto the table with a clatter that echoed faintly through the room. "I'll be back to take your order," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. From his vantage point near the kitchen's edge, Ethan tightened his grip on the tray he was drying. His cheeks flushed as he watched his mother's performance unfold before him. Working part-time as a busboy, he was used to the subtle power plays of the front-of-house staff. But tonight was different. This wasn't a regular customer awkwardly out of place. This was a man who, despite his casual clothes, radiated confidence that even the most polished patrons in La Lumiere couldn't match. Ethan's heart twisted with a mix of embarrassment and quiet resentment toward his mother's behavior, his pulse quickening as he glanced back toward the dining room where murmurs were beginning to rise. Emily, oblivious to her son's presence, returned to the front desk, smoothing her uniform as though erasing her earlier arrogance with polished gestures. She exchanged a few words with a colleague, her laughter forced and too loud, her words laced with an air of superiority. "Did you see that guy?" she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Coming in here looking like he just walked off the street. Some people really have no sense of place." Her colleague, a younger hostess, shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Nearby diners caught the remark, their whispers filling the space between Emily's sneers and the gentle clink of silverware. Back at his table, Shaq skimmed the menu with casual interest, his expression as calm as if he were browsing through a friend's cookbook rather than enduring public mockery. He glanced up occasionally, his gaze sweeping across the room, noting the subtle glances, the whispers, the tightening of lips. His presence was a silent disruption to the restaurant's unspoken hierarchy, a quiet protest against the polished exclusivity Emily tried so hard to enforce. Yet he gave no hint of agitation, no sign of the discomfort she hoped to provoke. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he cleared a nearby table, his mind racing. His mother's voice, the way she had sneered at the man, filled his ears, but so did the quiet dignity with which Shaq carried himself. He bit his lip, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. He was just a busboy, after all. But as he wiped down the table, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, heavier than the dishes he carried night after night. He had never seen anyone handle his mother's condescension with such poised resolve, and it sparked a mix of admiration and guilt within him. Meanwhile, Emily lingered near the bar, her eyes flickering occasionally toward Shaq's table, watching for any sign of frustration, any excuse to dismiss him further. When a few guests sent sympathetic glances toward the corner, she waved them off with a flippant hand. "Don't worry," she said to no one in particular, her voice chorusing over the low hum of conversation. "He'll be gone before dessert. They always are." But Shaq didn't leave. He remained seated, unbothered, his presence like a calm center in a whirlpool of judgment. He unfolded his napkin, placed it on his lap, and resumed browsing the menu, as if he were there simply to enjoy an evening out. His patience was disarming, his silence louder than any rebuttal could have been. Ethan's eyes locked on his mother, his throat tightening as he realized the unspoken lesson unfolding before him. This wasn't just a customer being mistreated, it was a mirror reflecting his mother's own biases, a quiet confrontation that didn't need raised voices or slammed doors to make its point. He hesitated, the weight of his apron pressing against his chest, his instincts torn between loyalty to his mother and the undeniable respect he felt for Shaq's quiet composure. As Emily finally returned to Shaq's table, menu in hand, her posture was stiff, her smile thin and forced. "Have you decided what you'll be ordering?" she asked, her voice brittle. Shaq glanced up, his gaze unwavering. "Yes," he said, his tone even. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini." His choice, the most expensive item on the menu, sent a visible ripple through Emily's composure. She faltered for the briefest moment, then recovered with a scoff. "Of course," she said, turning away before he could respond. Her retreat was quick, her steps sharp as though she were trying to outrun the stares of the now silent diners. In the shadows, Ethan's decision crystallized. He wouldn't let this continue. As the tension in the room coiled tighter, as whispers turned into quiet condemnation of Emily's behavior, he stepped out from behind the kitchen partition, his hands trembling but his voice steady. He didn't know exactly what he would say, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. The rising tension was no longer just about a mother's arrogance or a man's composure. It was about the silent bystander, about the choice between complicity and courage. The stakes weren't just about one dinner. They were about integrity, about standing up when it mattered most. And Ethan, unnoticed by his mother, was about to step into the light. The low murmur of conversation in La Lumiere took on a sharper edge, as more diners began to pick up on the tension orbiting Shaq's corner table. Despite the soft clatter of cutlery and the muted clinking of wine glasses, an air of unease settled over the restaurant like an invisible haze. Shaq, seated alone under the gentle glow of an ornate wall sconce, continued to leaf through the menu with an ease that belied the undercurrent of disdain he faced. His expression remained calm, his shoulders relaxed, his lips curling faintly at the corners as though the surrounding whispers were nothing more than a breeze against a towering mountain. Emily, meanwhile, flitted between tables, her composure cracking at the edges as she continued her orchestrated indifference toward Shaq. She stopped to laugh a little too loudly at a patron's joke, leaned in a little too closely to refill a wine glass, but her eyes darted again and again toward the man she'd tried so hard to belittle. Her efforts to re-establish her sense of control were unraveling, fraying in the face of a presence she couldn't rattle. The diners nearby were no longer amused by her antics. Their sidelong glances, once casual, now brimmed with silent judgment. A couple at a table near the window exchanged hushed words, one of them shaking their head with a frown, while others stole looks at Emily with mounting disapproval. Ethan stood frozen just beyond the kitchen's threshold, a stack of freshly dried glasses in his trembling hands. His pulse raced as he watched his mother's increasingly forced gestures and heard the barely veiled comments she made within earshot of Shaq's table. His throat tightened, a sour taste rising as he recalled the man's serene gaze, the quiet dignity with which he had borne his mother's provocations. Ethan felt a twist of shame, not just for his mother's behavior but for his own silence. He'd always known she had a tendency to judge quickly, to use the veneer of authority her job provided as a shield against perceived slights. But tonight her words cut deeper than he'd ever realized. The room seemed to contract around Shaq as if the space itself leaned in to observe him more closely. His calm defiance didn't need words. It was written in the way he folded his napkin precisely on his lap, in the way he kept his posture steady as if he'd anchored himself amid a storm. Emily's attempts to provoke discomfort had only highlighted her own pettiness, and now even her colleagues shifted uncomfortably as they noticed the shift in the air. A young hostess at the reservation desk hesitated before glancing nervously toward Emily, then toward the diners who were beginning to exchange pointed glances. Ethan's mind churned with indecision, his fingers tightening around the fragile glass he held. He felt the weight of his mother's earlier warnings about staying in his place, about not questioning her authority in front of customers. But wasn't that what he was doing now, silently standing by while she humiliated a man who had done nothing wrong? The realization hit him hard, a pang in his chest that made it difficult to breathe. He wasn't just a bystander to this evening's unfolding drama. He was complicit in it by his silence. His gaze darted back to Shaq, whose presence, though quiet, was magnetic, a beacon of resilience that drew not just admiration but also a subtle challenge. Will you stand with me, or will you stay silent? The tension in the restaurant escalated as Emily's false composure finally cracked. She approached Shaq's table with an exaggerated sway, her voice tight and falsely sweet. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" she asked, her words dripping with a condescension thinly veiled behind a brittle smile. Her fingers tapped nervously on the edge of the table as though daring him to react. Shaq lifted his gaze slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a calmness that seemed to hollow out the space between them. "It's quite fine," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough weight to remind her, and everyone within earshot, that her efforts to diminish him had failed utterly. Emily's face flushed, her lips tightening as she pivoted sharply on her heel and stalked back toward the bar. Her footsteps echoed louder than before, each one punctuated by the silent realization among the diners that her power was slipping away. Several patrons whispered openly now, their eyes following her retreating figure before returning to Shaq, who remained an unmoved pillar amidst the restaurant's gathering storm. Ethan's internal struggle reached its boiling point. His hands shook as he set the glassware down with a quiet clatter, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He could feel the weight of a decision pressing down on him, whether to confront his mother, to step into the open, where her disappointment and wrath might land squarely on his shoulders, or to continue hiding in the shadows, complicit in her degradation of a man who had shown nothing but grace. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, louder than the murmurs, louder than the low hum of conversation, until it was the only sound he could hear. Then, almost involuntarily, his feet shifted forward, carrying him out of the kitchen's sheltering shadows and into the softly lit dining area. He hesitated near the edge of the floor, his gaze flickering between his mother, still fuming by the bar, and Shaq, who remained a steady, silent presence at his table. His palms were damp, his throat dry, but he felt a strange steadiness settle over him. He wasn't just a boy carrying dishes tonight. He was a witness to a truth that demanded to be acknowledged. The diners closest to Ethan noticed his tentative approach, their conversations pausing as curiosity replaced their earlier amusement. Emily, sensing the shift, turned sharply and caught sight of her son standing there, his eyes wide but resolute. A flash of surprise crossed her face, quickly masked by irritation. "Ethan," she hissed, her voice a low warning audible to the surrounding tables. "What are you doing? Get back to your station." But Ethan didn't move, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his gaze steady on hers. His lips parted but no words came yet, only a shallow breath of defiance. The moment stretched, suspended in a silence thick with anticipation, as if the entire room were holding its collective breath, waiting for the boy to speak, to break the script written by his mother's arrogance. Shaq's gaze met Ethan's, a quiet nod of encouragement passing between them. It wasn't a command, wasn't a plea. It was simply an acknowledgement, a recognition of shared humanity and quiet courage. Ethan felt the weight of it settle over his shoulders, anchoring him even as his mother's disapproval bore down on him like a physical force. He inhaled deeply, his voice trembling but clear as he finally spoke, his words slicing through the charged air. "Mom, this isn't right," he said softly, his tone laden with quiet conviction. "You're wrong. You're being unfair." The silence that followed was complete. No cutlery scraped against plates. No glasses clinked. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant turned toward Ethan, the quiet boy who had stepped out from the background to challenge not just his mother's authority but the unspoken rules of prejudice that had shaped the night. Emily's face blanched, her lips parting as if to respond, but the words tangled in her throat. She could only stand there, her composure unraveling in the face of a truth too stark to deny. The shift in power was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, woven into the fabric of the restaurant's silence. Ethan had spoken, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Just as the silent tension in La Lumiere reached its peak, a new figure emerged from the subdued shadows of the restaurant's interior. Mr. Thompson, the manager, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the gleaming floor. His neatly pressed suit reflected the restaurant's standards, but tonight, his usually composed demeanor carried an undercurrent of unease. His eyes scanned the dining room, locking onto the solitary figure seated in the corner, and realization dawned like a jolt through his system. The chatter at surrounding tables faltered as Mr. Thompson's purposeful steps cut through the charged atmosphere, his path unerringly direct. Ethan, standing frozen by the kitchen's edge, watched with wide eyes as the manager approached Shaq's table. His pulse raced, confusion rippling through his mind. Why was Mr. Thompson, always so unflappable, so reserved, approaching this particular customer with such urgency? His mother, Emily, now visibly tense, straightened her posture behind the bar, her face paling as she noticed the manager's focus. The quiet hush that descended over the restaurant was pierced only by the soft clink of a wine glass and the shuffle of chairs as patrons leaned closer to observe. When Mr. Thompson reached Shaq, he gave a slight bow, his voice low and filled with deference. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, the weight of recognition coloring every syllable. "I'm so sorry for the wait, sir. We had no idea you'd be dining with us tonight." The ripple of realization swept through the restaurant like an invisible wave. Nearby diners gasped softly, whispers of Shaquille O'Neal, curling around the room like smoke. Eyes that had previously held judgment now shimmered with a mix of awe and embarrassment. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He blinked rapidly, his cheeks flushing a deep crimson as his mind reeled. Shaquille O'Neal. The name echoed inside him, reverberating through memories of games watched from the family's modest living room, of the towering figure who represented not just athletic prowess but a story of resilience, of overcoming, of integrity. His own mother, had dismissed and ridiculed this man. The shame rose within him, thick and constricting, wrapping around his ribs like a tightening rope. Shaq, still composed, placed his cutlery neatly on the edge of his plate, and looked up at Mr. Thompson with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His voice, deep and smooth, resonated through the suddenly hushed space. "It's all right," he said quietly. "I just wanted a quiet meal, that's all." His tone, calm but edged with a subtle weight, made it clear that the offense wasn't forgotten, even if forgiveness was offered. Emily, now standing rooted to the spot behind the bar, felt the blood drain from her face. The laughter she had forced earlier dissolved into silence, the mocking remarks she'd made echoing in her own mind with a bitter aftertaste. The weight of collective judgment bore down on her shoulders, heavier than the silver trays she carried. Her gaze dropped to the polished floor, her hands trembling slightly, as she realized the magnitude of her error. Her authority, once asserted through curt words and dismissive gestures, crumbled beneath the truth of who Shaq was and what he represented. Ethan's shame deepened, not just for his mother but for himself. His silence had contributed to the injustice, and now the knowledge of Shaq's identity transformed his quiet guilt into something sharper, something that demanded action. His heart pounded, a mix of regret and determination stirring within him. He wasn't just witnessing his mother's humiliation, he was experiencing the collapse of the small safe world he'd tried to hide within. Mr. Thompson, recognizing the shift in the room's dynamics, cast a brief, sharp glance toward Emily. His voice when he spoke again was gentle but firm. "Emily," he said, his words cutting through the stillness, "please come with me for a moment." The request wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an unspoken reprimand. Emily hesitated, her feet unwilling to move, but the judgment in the air propelled her forward. She followed the manager with small, faltering steps, her head bowed, her once confident gait now hesitant and uneven. Ethan's stomach twisted as he watched her go, his hands clenched at his sides, his throat tightening with a mixture of helplessness and longing to make amends. He looked back at Shaq, who remained seated, his calmness a stark contrast to the swirling emotions enveloping the restaurant. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Ethan felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. A quiet acknowledgement that while mistakes had been made, there was still a path toward redemption. The diners resumed their murmuring, but now the whispers were colored with admiration for Shaq's poise and sharp disappointment for the staff's earlier behavior. A couple near the window exchanged looks, one shaking their head. "That was Shaquille O'Neal the whole time," one whispered. "I can't believe she treated him that way." The words hung heavy in the air, echoes of collective disapproval that couldn't be swept aside. Mr. Thompson returned to Shaq's table, his expression apologetic. "Mr. O'Neal," he said softly, "I assure you this won't happen again. We're deeply sorry for the way you were treated. I'll personally ensure that your experience from here forward is what it should have been, from the start." His words, though sincere, were tinged with the realization that no amount of formality could undo the damage already done. Shaq, his gaze steady but not unkind, nodded once. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I think it's not just me you owe an apology to." His words, simple but profound, shifted the focus from himself to the principle at stake. It wasn't about celebrity or reputation. It was about respect, about the way every person should be treated, regardless of status or appearance. Ethan's eyes stung with the weight of that truth. His earlier hesitation felt like a betrayal, his inaction a silent agreement with his mother's judgment. He swallowed hard, stepping forward with a sudden resolve. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "I'm sorry, I should have said something sooner. I didn't. His words tangled in his throat, but Shaq's gentle nod stopped him. "It's never too late to do the right thing," Shaq said quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that silenced the remaining murmurs. Ethan's breath caught, his shoulders loosening slightly as the weight of his shame was met with a chance for redemption. Emily stood near the kitchen entrance, her head bowed, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. She had built her sense of authority on shaky ground, and now it was collapsing beneath the weight of truth and consequence. Yet in that moment, as she witnessed her son's quiet apology and the dignified forgiveness offered by Shaq, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within her, a recognition of her own fallibility, a dawning understanding of the power of humility. The power dynamic in La Lumiere had shifted. What had begun as a calculated attempt to dismiss and humiliate a man who appeared out of place had evolved into a moment of profound reckoning. The once mocked patron had become the quiet teacher, the underestimated boy the voice of change, and the overconfident waitress the symbol of a lesson painfully learned. And though the evening's course had irrevocably altered, it was clear that the real story, the story of integrity, humility, and redemption, was only just beginning. Emily hesitated at the edge of the floor, her gaze briefly darting toward Shaq before dropping to the marble tiles beneath her feet. Every step she took back into the public eye felt heavier than the last. The quiet murmurs of diners were a stark contrast to her earlier arrogance, now replaced by stifled conversations colored by guilt and curiosity. As she crossed the floor, her eyes flicked toward the kitchen where Ethan, standing half-shadowed by the doorway, watched her with an expression of disappointment she had never seen in him before. It wasn't just the judgment of strangers she feared now, it was the realization of her son's silent witness. Shaq slowly rose from his seat, his towering figure commanding attention not through aggression but with an air of calm authority. The movement silenced the restaurant further, all eyes gravitating toward him, curious to hear what he might say. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His deep tone carried effortlessly through the hush. Respect isn't about knowing someone's name or recognizing their face, he began, his gaze sweeping the room. It's about how we treat every person who walks through those doors, whether they're wearing a suit or sweatpants, a diamond ring or none at all. They deserve dignity. Emily's breath caught, the words resonating louder than any reprimand Mr. Thompson might have given. Her throat tightened, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. It was a truth she had ignored in her quest for self-importance, a truth now impossible to deny. Before she could respond, a soft but steady voice broke the silence from the kitchen doorway. Mom. The word, simple and clear, cut through the tension like a knife. Every head turned as Ethan stepped forward, his youthful face flushed but his posture firm. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes remained steady, locked on his mother's. Mom, you were wrong. I saw how you treated him. I heard what you said, and it wasn't just embarrassing, it was hurtful. Emily's lips parted, but no words emerged. The color drained from her face as the realization of her actions collided with the weight of her son's disappointment. Ethan took another step closer, his voice stronger now, though tinged with the raw edge of heartbreak. You always told me to respect people, to be fair, but tonight, you didn't do that. You judged someone because of how they looked, and you made them feel small. That's not the kind of person you taught me to be. The restaurant was silent, save for the faint clink of a glass being set down, and the barely audible rustle of fabric, as diners shifted in their seats. No one interrupted, the entire room transfixed by the quiet courage of the young boy confronting his mother's failings. Emily's shoulders sagged as though an invisible weight pressed down on her. Her eyes glistened, and she opened her mouth, but again, no words came. The apology she'd rehearsed in her mind evaporated, beneath the quiet condemnation of her own child. Ethan's words, simple and unembellished, carried more weight than any corporate reprimand could. Shaq regarded Ethan with a gentle nod, a faint, encouraging smile touching his lips. You've got a good head on your shoulders, he said quietly. It's not easy to stand up like that, especially to someone you care about. But you did it with respect. That's real courage. Ethan's throat bobbed as he swallowed the lump that had formed there, his chest rising and falling with the effort to hold back tears. He nodded once, the gesture small but firm. Emily, her voice finally emerging as a cracked whisper, said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to be like this. Her gaze flicked between her son and Shaq, her defenses crumbling as the magnitude of her actions settled in. I got caught up in appearances. I forgot what really matters. Shaq's eyes, though steady, softened, just a fraction. The truth is, it's easy to forget. But what matters is remembering before it's too late. It's about listening, seeing the person behind the clothes, the title, the surface. We all have that choice. Ethan's eyes glistened with the sheen of unshed tears. But he drew a slow breath, his shoulders lifting in resolve. We can do better, Mom, he said, his voice quiet but determined. We have to. The diners, who had remained frozen in the tableau of confrontation, slowly began nodding, a few murmuring agreements. Lisa, the young woman from the neighboring table, leaned toward her companion, her voice low but fervent. That kid just said everything we were all thinking, she whispered. He's braver than most adults in here. Mr. Carter, from his central table, raised his wine glass slightly in silent acknowledgement of the moment, his wife's hand resting gently on his arm. It's rare, he murmured, to see such honesty, especially from someone so young. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not of self-pity, but of the painful realization that her son's integrity had outshone her own. She drew a shaky breath and gave a small, fragile nod. I'll do better, she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the space but clear enough for those nearest to hear. I'll learn from this. Shaq inclined his head, his voice warm but laced with a subtle firmness. That's a start, he said. His tone wasn't triumphant or condescending, but it left no room for dismissal. Because respect isn't just words, it's action. It's how we carry ourselves, how we treat each other when no one's looking, or when everyone is. Ethan stepped closer to his mother, his hand brushing hers lightly. The gesture was not one of forgiveness yet, but of a bridge, a willingness to help her cross the chasm between arrogance and understanding. Together they stood before Shaq, the silence now rich with the weight of their mutual reckoning. And though the atmosphere in La Numère had shifted from smug condescension to profound reflection, one truth had crystallized. Respect was not given. It was earned through humility, action, and the courage to admit fault. As Ethan's quiet stand reverberated through the hearts of those present, the story had moved beyond mere judgment. It had become a lesson, a catalyst for change, and a testament to the strength it takes to face one's own failings head-on. Shaq's towering frame remained steady, his gaze sweeping the room, pulling everyone into the quiet storm of truth he was about to unleash. His deep voice, calm yet imbued with a weight of lived experience, cut through the air like a warm blade. "Respect isn't a favor," he said, his words resonant and deliberate. "It's not something you give to those who look a certain way, who speak a certain way, or who you think belong. Respect is the baseline, the bare minimum. It's how we see each other as human, as equal." Every ear strained toward his voice, the earlier background murmurs evaporating like mist under sunlight. Emily, standing a few feet away with her shoulders hunched, felt the weight of each word settle into her chest, heavier than any shame she had imagined. Her cheeks flushed, her lips trembled, but no excuses dared form. She could only listen as her son Ethan took a step forward, his youthful frame slightly trembling, yet anchored by a newfound resolve. Ethan's voice rang out, clear and trembling with the weight of raw honesty. "He's right," he said, surprising everyone, including himself. "What we did wasn't just rude, it was wrong. We were supposed to treat everyone with respect, but we didn't. I didn't stop it. I didn't speak up, but I see it now, and I'm sorry." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't falter. His gaze darted toward Shaq, then back to his mother, silently pleading with her to see the truth reflected in his words. Emily's heart twisted in her chest, a mix of pride and regret swirling together in a bitter cocktail. She'd raised Ethan to be polite, to value kindness, yet tonight she had shown him a version of herself she barely recognized. Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palms, as she felt her carefully crafted facade crumble under the weight of her own son's quiet defiance. Shaq regarded Ethan with a nod of approval, his voice softening with an undercurrent of genuine respect. "You've got heart, kid," he said. "It takes courage to speak up, especially when it's hardest. That's how change starts. One voice, one choice at a time." He turned his gaze back to Emily, his expression neither harsh nor vindictive, but unwavering. "The hardest part isn't admitting you were wrong," he continued, his voice a steady pulse of calm. "It's doing something about it. It's being willing to look in the mirror and decide what kind of person you want to be, not just for yourself but for the people who look up to you." The diners, who had been frozen in the wake of Ethan's declaration, began to exchange glances. Quiet nods rippled through the room, a collective recognition that this moment was no longer just a lesson for Emily. It was a mirror for them all. Lisa, the young woman at the adjacent table, murmured to her companion, "That kid's braver than most adults I know." Mr. Carter, the elderly gentleman with silver hair, raised his glass in silent salute to Ethan, his wife brushing away a discreet tear. Emily's breath hitched, her lips parting, as though to speak, but no words emerged. She felt the prick of tears at the corners of her eyes, the realization dawning that this wasn't just a personal failure, it was a public one, magnified by her son's integrity. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she finally managed to speak. I was wrong," she admitted, her tone trembling but sincere. "I let pride and appearances cloud my judgment. I forgot that respect is for everyone, not just those who fit a certain image. And I'm sorry, truly sorry." The sincerity in her voice was met with a hush that seemed to deepen the gravity of the moment. Shaq gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Apologies matter," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But what matters more is what you do next, how you treat people tomorrow, and the day after that, because that's what real respect looks like. It's not a performance, it's a habit." Ethan stepped closer to his mother, his small hand reaching for hers. Emily flinched at first, uncertain if she deserved his forgiveness, but when his fingers curled around hers, she felt the subtle weight of his silent acceptance. His hand wasn't just an olive branch, it was a bridge, a chance for her to step onto the path of redemption he had quietly carved out with his words. The tension in the room, thick as it had been moments ago, shifted. It wasn't the crackle of confrontation anymore. It was the sigh of release, of catharsis. The diners began to murmur quietly, their conversations tinged with reflection rather than judgment. Even Mr. Thompson, the manager who had so quickly recognized Shaq's presence, appeared less composed, his rigid posture softening as he realized the depth of what had unfolded in his restaurant. Shaq's voice lowered, but it carried just as clearly, resonating with a quiet, undeniable authority. La Lumar is just one restaurant, one place, he said. But tonight, it's been a reminder that respect isn't confined to fancy walls or designer suits. It's a choice we make every day, in how we look at people, how we speak to them, and how we choose to listen. Ethan's head lifted slightly, his expression clearing, as if a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had finally been lifted. Emily squeezed his hand gently, her own face streaked with silent tears, the lines of pride and arrogance replaced by humility and quiet determination. Shaq glanced around the room, his gaze steady and encompassing. We all have moments when we slip, when we let pride or fear guide us instead of empathy, he concluded. But what defines us isn't the mistake, it's what we do after. And tonight I think we've all been reminded of that. As his final words hung in the air, the diners slowly began to clap, a ripple of quiet applause that swelled into a gentle but undeniable ovation. Not for Shaq as the basketball legend, but for the lesson he had delivered with grace, patience, and an unwavering belief in dignity. Emily's tears slipped freely down her cheeks, but this time they weren't born of humiliation. They were the cleansing, transformative tears of someone who had finally painfully seen her own reflection clearly. Ethan, standing tall beside her, felt the warmth of the room shift toward him, not in judgment but in quiet admiration. He had spoken truth to power, not with anger or accusation, but with courage and conviction. His voice had cracked open a door his mother never would have opened on her own, and in doing so had reminded everyone that change is always possible, even when it's uncomfortable. La Lumiere, bathed in the soft glow of its crystal chandeliers, no longer shimmered with mere elegance. It resonated with a truth that would echo long after the last plate was cleared, and at the heart of it stood a boy, his mother, and a man whose calm strength had turned a quiet confrontation into a timeless lesson in human dignity. Her face, once rigid with judgment, now softened into an expression of raw vulnerability. The room, previously thick with the murmurs of shock and disapproval, settled into a heavy silence as all eyes focused on her. Ethan's small but steady hand in hers acted as an anchor, tethering her to the ground as she prepared to face the collective gaze of diners and staff alike. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke, the words clinging together like fragile glass shards. "I was wrong," she admitted, her throat tight and her cheeks flushed with a mixture of humiliation and sincerity. "I let appearances cloud my judgment. I let pride convince me I was better than someone because of how they looked. But I see it now how wrong I was, how much I need to change." Her confession wasn't met with immediate applause or comforting words. Instead, the silence deepened, becoming a shared space where the weight of her admission could truly be felt. A few diners exchanged glances, some surprised, others contemplative. Mr. Carter, seated at his table with a hand lightly resting on his wine glass, gave a slow, approving nod, while his wife leaned closer, whispering, "She's finally seeing it, truly seeing it." Ethan, his face flushed but composed, gave his mother's hand a gentle squeeze. His own voice, though smaller and less seasoned, carried with it the steady strength of youthful conviction. "You can do better, Mom," he said softly but firmly. "What happened tonight can change, but it has to start with you." His words were not a reprimand, but a quiet offer of redemption, a bridge between the past and a future yet unwritten. Emily's lips trembled as she absorbed her son's words, her eyes shimmering with the faint gleam of unshed tears. Her usual practiced confidence was gone, replaced by a humble sincerity that made her seem almost unfamiliar to the onlookers who had watched her earlier with disdain. "I don't expect forgiveness tonight," she murmured, her voice barely carrying over the hushed ambiance. "But I hope to show, from this moment on, that I've learned, that I can become better, for my son and for everyone I've wronged." The quiet murmurings of the diners shifted subtly, a mixture of cautious hope and tentative acceptance beginning to fill the space. Lisa, a young woman from a nearby table, who had earlier expressed frustration at Emily's behavior, exchanged a glance with her companion and nodded faintly. "At least she's trying," Lisa whispered, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. "That takes courage too." Ethan stepped a little closer to his mother, his small frame standing tall beside her. "It's not just about saying sorry, Mom," he said quietly, yet his words resonated in the stillness. "It's about what you do next. We can both make better choices from now on, together." The sincerity of Ethan's words created a ripple in the room, breaking the heavy silence like the first stirrings of dawn after a long night. The collective judgment that had once hovered like a storm cloud over Emily began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative, shared understanding. Even Miss Thompson, the restaurant manager, who had approached with a mixture of authority and concern, allowed his rigid stance to soften. "That's what matters most," he said quietly, stepping closer. "It's not about perfection. It's about the willingness to grow and change." Shaq, still seated with his hands resting lightly on the table, watched the unfolding scene with a quiet, thoughtful gaze. His earlier composure remained intact, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, something between approval and quiet relief. He leaned slightly forward, his voice low but carrying easily across the now silent dining room. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said, the deep timbre of his voice wrapping around the room like a gentle echo. "But it's what we do after the mistake that defines us. It's not about appearances or first impressions. It's about integrity, about treating everyone with respect, even when no one's watching." Emily's head dipped, her shoulders curling inward as though trying to absorb the truth of his words. She glanced hesitantly at Ethan, her lips parting to speak, but instead of words, a single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. It wasn't the kind of tear born of frustration or humiliation. It was the quiet, cleansing tear of realization and hope. Ethan reached up and gently brushed the tear from her face with his thumb, his own eyes shining but steady. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, a flicker of a smile ghosting across his lips. "We're going to be okay." The diners, who had once watched in judgment and disdain, now found themselves drawn into the quiet gravity of the moment. A few nodded subtly, their expressions softening, while others glanced down at their plates, their own reflections mirroring the quiet humility that had transformed Emily from antagonist to human. Lisa offered a small, encouraging smile, her earlier frustration melting into empathy. Mr. Carter clinked his glass lightly, not as a toast, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the profound shift in the room's energy. Mr. Thompson exhaled softly, his posture relaxing as he addressed both Emily and the gathered staff. "Let this be a lesson for us all," he said, his tone even and measured. "A reminder that we're not just serving meals, we're serving people, people with stories, dignity, and worth, no matter what they wear or how they walk through our doors." Shaq rose slowly, his height and presence drawing every eye, but his expression remained calm, almost serene. His gaze settled on Emily and Ethan, a quiet respect gleaming in his eyes. "Tonight wasn't about me," he said, his voice steady and warm. "It was about recognizing that we all have the power to change, to choose kindness over arrogance, to listen when it's hardest, to be better, even when no one's expecting it." Emily, now standing with Ethan's hand in hers, and her gaze lifted, nodded once, a simple, honest gesture of acknowledgement. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. "For the lesson, for your patience, for showing me what I should have seen from the start." As the soft sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversations resumed, the atmosphere in the Lumiere shifted from icy judgment to a quiet, collective breath of reconciliation. The night's tension, once palpable and stifling, dissolved into an air of cautious hope, a shared understanding that growth was possible, and that the path forward, though difficult, was worth walking. In the gentle glow of the chandeliers, with Emily's humble apology and Ethan's steadfast encouragement echoing in every corner, Le Lumiere felt a little less like a stage of pretense, and a little more like a space of transformation. The diners' lingering stares softened, and one by one, they returned to their meals, their conversations now colored, not by gossip, but by an unspoken respect for the quiet, powerful lesson they had witnessed unfold before them. Ethan, having shed his busboy apron, lingered near his mother, his eyes downcast. His earlier shock now settled into a deep, gnawing guilt. Throughout the evening, he had watched in growing horror as his mother's dismissive actions unfolded, each word and gesture a blow not just to Shaq, but to the very integrity Ethan had tried so hard to emulate. Now, standing in the quiet aftermath, he found himself caught between the urge to speak and the weight of unspoken shame. Shaq's deep voice cut through the silence, drawing every eye. "Everyone here tonight witnessed something important," he began, his tone steady yet layered with quiet conviction. "It wasn't just about a meal or how someone looks, it was about how we treat each other, and what we let happen in our spaces." Emily, standing stiffly with her arms folded tight across her chest, glanced briefly at her son. The realization of how her actions had mirrored the prejudice she'd long despised in others tightened her throat. The hush that fell over the staff was heavy, each one reflecting inwardly on the silent complicity that had allowed her words and actions to go unchecked. I came here for a quiet dinner, Shaq continued, his gaze moving from face to face, but what I witnessed was a reflection of a bigger problem. This isn't just about tonight, it's about the small choices we make every day. Whether we choose kindness or judgment, respect or contempt. Ethan stepped forward then, his voice low but clear. I'm sorry, he said, his words trembling but honest. I should have spoken up. I saw what was happening, but I didn't say anything. I was afraid, and I shouldn't have been. His eyes met Shaq's, and for a brief moment his youthful guilt collided with an unspoken need for guidance. Shaq nodded slowly, his expression neither dismissive nor patronizing. It takes courage to admit that, he said. And it's a start. It's not about being perfect. It's about recognizing when we've made a mistake and choosing to do better. The weight of Shaq's words sank into Emily's bones. She glanced at her son, his posture tentative, his shoulders hunched, and felt a sudden sharp pang of regret. Her earlier arrogance, the mocking sneers she'd aimed at Shaq, now felt like self-inflicted wounds. More than that, Ethan's disappointment, so plainly etched across his face, mirrored the shame she'd long buried beneath layers of false superiority. With a shaky breath, Emily stepped forward, her voice uneven. I was wrong, she admitted, her words quieter than Ethan's, but no less piercing. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I failed everyone tonight, especially my son. I've spent years teaching him to respect people, and tonight I showed him the opposite. She turned to Shaq, her gaze steady but humble. I'm truly sorry, not because of who you are, but because I forgot who I was supposed to be. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, brimming with the quiet weight of recognition and the fragile promise of change. Shaq nodded, his expression softening. Apology accepted, he said, his tone gentle but firm. But this can't just be about saying sorry, it's about what you do next. About making sure this doesn't happen again. Mr. Thompson, standing to the side, spoke up then, his voice carrying both authority and gratitude. Shaq is right. Tonight we failed in our responsibility to create a space where everyone feels respected. That changes now. We'll be reviewing our policies, holding training sessions, and making sure that this place truly reflects the values we claim to stand for. Ethan glanced at his mother, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes. I want to help, he said quietly, his voice steadying with resolve. Not just to fix what happened tonight, but to make this a place we can both be proud of. Emily's throat tightened, her heart swelling with a bittersweet mix of pride and regret. Me too, she whispered, her voice trembling but sincere. I need to be better, not just for the customers, but for myself, and for you. Shaq smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a gesture that held both forgiveness and challenge. That's the real lesson, he said. Change isn't about what we say, it's about what we do. Every day in the small moments that define us. The staff, some with heads bowed and others with newfound resolve in their eyes, nodded in agreement. The atmosphere, once thick with tension, now hummed with the quiet energy of transformation. This wasn't a dramatic conclusion, but a subtle pivot, a moment where choices shifted, and the seeds of change were planted. Shaq, sensing the shift, stepped back slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Remember, respect isn't reserved for those we recognize. It's for everyone who walks through that door. That's how we build something better. One choice at a time. Ethan straightened, his youthful determination solidifying. Emily, standing beside him, squared her shoulders, her earlier arrogance replaced with a quiet, humble resolve. Around them, the staff of La Lumore seemed to exhale, the collective burden of complicity lifted, if only slightly. As the meeting drew to a close, Shaq turned to Mr. Thompson, offering a simple nod. Thank you for listening, he said, and for being willing to make it right. Mr. Thompson returned the nod, his voice tinged with gratitude. Thank you for reminding us what really matters. With that, Shaq quietly exited the circle, his presence leaving behind not silence but the low murmur of staff members exchanging thoughtful words, their voices carrying the faintest hint of hope. Emily and Ethan lingered for a moment longer, the weight of the night still settling in, but the path forward now clearer. As Shaq stepped into the cool night air, the city's lights reflected in the windows of La Lumiere behind him, a quiet testament to a night of reckoning and resolve. He knew the real change wouldn't happen overnight, but tonight had been a beginning, a story not just of correction, but of transformation, and that he thought as he walked into the evening's embrace. was worth every quiet step he'd taken. Emily glanced up, her eyes meeting Ethan's. There was no need for words. The heavy silence between them carried more weight than any apology. She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly, as though unsure whether to reach out or retreat. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the hush of the restaurant. "I've always taught you to treat everyone with respect. But tonight, I failed, and I saw the way you looked at me. The disappointment, it hurt more than anything anyone else could say." Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "I just didn't expect it from you," he said, his voice quiet, almost fragile. "I thought you were better than that, but I think you can be." He hesitated, then added, "And I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I was scared, but that's no excuse." Emily's lips trembled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, Ethan, you did more than I did. You stood there, you saw, and you learned."
That's more than I can say for myself. But I promise you, I'm going to change.
"I'm going to make this right, not just for Shaq, but for everyone who walks through those doors. And for you, so you can be proud of me again." Their quiet exchange, unnoticed by most, was the real culmination of the night's lessons. It wasn't about the public apologies or the promises of better policies. It was about this raw, unguarded moment, where a mother and son confronted not just each other's expectations, but their own. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his posture softening as he nodded. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steadier now. "Together." Outside, Shaq paused at the edge of the sidewalk, glancing back at La Lumiere one last time. He imagined the scene unfolding within, the quiet exchanges, the silent promises, the determination beginning to take root. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't triumph he felt, but something deeper, more enduring. He knew that true change didn't come from grand speeches or public shaming. It came from small personal shifts in perspective, from choices made in quiet moments when no one else was watching. He thought of Emily, not as the antagonist of the evening, but as a woman caught in her own blind spots, forced to confront the consequences of her assumptions. He thought of Ethan, his youthful resolve shining through the cracks of hesitation, embodying the courage to hold even those closest to him accountable. And he thought of the staff, who had stood by in silence, but now perhaps would carry this lesson forward into their interactions with every guest, every colleague, every quiet moment where respect was a choice, not an obligation. Shaq's mind drifted to his own past, to the many times he had been judged not by the content of his character, but by the size of his frame, the color of his skin, the weight of his success. He knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be dismissed by a glance or a smirk, and yet he had always chosen calm over confrontation, dignity over defiance. Tonight had reminded him why. It wasn't just about making a statement. It was about planting seeds that would grow long after he was gone. He took a slow breath, feeling the cool night wrap around him like a quiet companion. In his mind, he imagined La Lumiere, months from now, a place where guests, regardless of their appearance, were welcomed with genuine warmth, where staff, shaped by tonight's event, approached every interaction with humility and respect, where Ethan, perhaps older and wiser, would walk through the doors, not as a hesitant observer, but as a young man proud of the space he helped shape. Behind him, the soft glow of the restaurant's windows flickered one last time before he turned away. He knew the story didn't end here. For Emily, for Ethan, for the staff and the diners who had borne witness, it was only just beginning. Change was slow, often invisible, and rarely acknowledged. But it started here, with a simple meal, a quiet confrontation, and the resolve to do better. As he walked down the dimly lit street, the sounds of the city rose around him, cars humming in the distance, footsteps echoing along the pavement, the faint buzz of neon signs. Each sound blended into a quiet symphony of possibility. The world wouldn't change overnight, but for those willing to listen, to learn, and to grow, it could shift one small choice at a time. He thought of the words he had spoken inside, the message he hoped would resonate beyond the walls of La Lumiere. Respect wasn't reserved for those we recognized. It was the birthright of every human being. And in the end, kindness wasn't about grand gestures or public applause. It was about the quiet, consistent decisions we make each day. To see, to acknowledge, to respect. As the city lights reflected off the glass towers around him, Shaq felt a quiet sense of peace. Tonight hadn't been about asserting power or demanding recognition. It had been about planting a seed that, with care, humility, and persistence, might one day grow into something stronger than prejudice, something more enduring than arrogance. It was, he realized, about hope. And with that thought, he continued walking, the soft shuffle of his footsteps fading into the night, leaving behind a story not of confrontation, but of quiet, transformative change, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of La Lumiere, carried forward in the hearts of those willing to listen, to reflect, and to choose respect. If this story moved you, think about the everyday choices you make and who they might impact. How will you challenge prejudice in your world today? Let's start with small moments of kindness and respect. Share your thoughts and stories with us, because your voice matters in making a difference.